The Man with the Yin-Yang Eyes. Season 3. Episode 15. After a long, uncomfortable journey, we finally reached our destination. But things did not go as smoothly as we initially planned. We were greeted by sharp spears. Soon, we were overpowered by the Aboriginal people and brought back to the village. Big D intentionally signaled to me. Big D whispered to me that as soon as the opportunity came, the two immediately attacked the people escorting us to run away. Feeling quite surprised by what Big D just said, I asked him again, "Aren't you going to give up here? We are already very close to the lantern." But it turned out that Big D had other plans. He planned that after escaping the surveillance of these Aboriginal people, we would find a way to sneak into the village and steal the lantern. As soon as I heard Big D's opinion, I couldn't help but shout, "I know this fat guy always makes unpredictable decisions, but I can't imagine how Big D would develop this method." I said to Big D, "Are you crazy? Did you leave your brain at Leo's house before you left? What were you thinking when you were about to do that, to turn the two of us into hedgehogs?" Seeing Big D's extremely unsightly expression, I knew that the situation was not very good. Still, there was no warning that it would not be possible to negotiate with these Aboriginal people. I persuaded Big D to keep going into the village and meet the mage. If it can't be negotiated, think about stealing the lantern. At this moment, an unexpected thing happened. One of the Aboriginal people escorting us suddenly stopped. His hands gripped the spear, and began to behave very strangely. The man's whole body was shaking like he was running a fever. His eyes were wide, and he could clearly see the bloodstains inside. While his hands were gripping the spear to keep him steady, his teeth were clenched as if he was fighting against something terrible. Seeing the Aboriginal man's condition, Big D couldn't help but worry. Still not taking his eyes off him, Big D said to me, "Hey Gregory, look what's wrong with that guy. Maybe he's sick and about to have a seizure?" Saying this, Big D suddenly fell silent, then his face turned gray as if he had just thought of something terrible. Not sure where Big D got information about the indigenous peoples of Indonesia still cannibals until now, so every time he thinks about it, he gets scared. Big D turned to me and said, "Hey, did that guy have some horrible contagious disease, and now he's having a temper tantrum? You should think of something else. It's not good to catch the disease from him." Hearing these things, I really don't know how to answer Big D. Raising my hand to do up my glasses, I slowly explained why the man had such a condition to Big D from the moment I met them. My first impression was that these people were all extremely healthy, but I discovered by accident that their bodies seemed to be controlled by an invisible force. In other words, this power is a form of witchcraft. It is this kind of witchcraft that causes these people to suddenly develop terrible pain. Like that, we slowly entered the village, but it was different from what I had seen on TV shows. There was no joyful atmosphere and typical activities of indigenous people. The whole village was filled with gloom and uncomfortable silence. Big D also felt an abnormality here. He asked me, unable to answer Big D's question. I had to tell him, "You'd better ask Leo this one, but you can put your hand down. Why do you have to hold it up like that?" Following what I said, Big D immediately dropped his hand, as if he was only now aware that he had been raising his hand all this time. But Big D's relaxed mood soon dissipated, and after taking a few steps, Big D's face was once again gray when he saw something. At this point, Big D couldn't hold it anymore. He just cried and said to me, "Now, do you believe me? Obviously they cannibals. You need proof, don't you? Look at them, do you believe me?" Feeling a little uneasy, I immediately looked in the direction Big D pointed. It turned out that the thing that scared Big D to his pants was an extinguished bonfire, on which a skeleton was still hanging. At a glance, I could tell that it was the dinner of these Aboriginal people, and of course, it was some animal, not a human bone. Looks like Big D is too obsessed. Just like in horror movies, when Big D was extremely scared, suddenly someone's scream was heard. This seems to have reached the limit of Big D's endurance. He fell to his knees, causing me to run over to catch him. Big D stammered to me, "Did you hear that? Someone just got killed. That's it, it's too late to run now." Looking at Big D right now, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I kept quiet. While holding Big D, who was no longer able to stand, I observed the entire village. Of course, I don't believe these people are cannibals like Big D says, but I noticed something was wrong with this village. It was like a dark force was covering the entire village, causing everyone here to be constantly tormented by disease and pain. Going a little further, a man asked Leo about our purpose in coming here. Leo answered that he was only supposed to lead the way. These people, he pointed at us, wanted to go to the clan witch to ask some important questions. Only now do I know that the indigenous mages in Indonesia are called wizards. Then they took me to a house in the middle of the village. Compared to the size of the surrounding houses, this house can be extremely large. The man stopped and told Leo he would be waiting outside, their wizard waiting for us inside. As I heard what Leo said again, I entered the house thinking, is it possible that the magic power of the witches here is so strong that it can predict our arrival? After entering the house, I immediately looked around at everything around. In the middle of the house was a red fire stove, on which something was boiling. On either side of the wall were many strange things that I had never seen in my life. It's not hard to see that the wizard we're looking for is the man sitting cross-legged in the middle of the house. He poured a blood-red liquid into a bowl and prepared it for the people around him to drink. On either side of the path, several people were lying on the ground, these people constantly groaning as if they were in extreme pain. These people were the source of the screams that Big D and I had heard before. Among the people lying in the house, I suddenly noticed a man near the door. He seemed to be in the most pain of the people lying here, and after a while of writhing, he couldn't take it anymore and shout. Accompanied by the man's scream, I could see his body begin to take on a terrifying expression. The man's abdomen was constantly expanding, accompanied by abnormal movements inside, like many snakes were trying to get out. Seeing this scene, Big D and Leo couldn't help but be surprised. As for me, it's not the first time I've seen weird things like this. Once you have eyes like mine, you will understand. After moving for a while in the man's stomach, it seemed that the thing inside had found the weakest place. It continuously pushed there to get out. Both Big D and I stared at it, not wanting to see a hole in the man's stomach, but our curiosity still made us want to know what it was. There was a wet sound, like someone poking a water-filled balloon with a needle and causing it to burst. The skin of the man's belly was finally torn, and in front of my eyes were countless strange-shaped snakes. They constantly turned towards the people around them and bared their fangs menacingly. Seeing the horrifying scene unfold before his eyes, Big D couldn't help but scream. Originally, Big D was not a coward. Still, this scene was so horrible, even I didn't expect it to be so serious. I recalled the expression of the man who escorted me here. It seemed that all of these people had been hit by some kind of witchcraft and sooner or later ended up like this poor man. The poor man could only groan a few more and then fell silent. Finally, he stopped breathing. Seeing what he had to go through, I suddenly thought death was the only way out for him. Witnessing everything like us, the wizard just shook his head and sighed. He took a cloth next to him and went to cover it over the poor man's body. After covering the body with a shroud, the wizard began to mutter something in her mouth. I guess he's healing the poor man. It's like me chanting a mantra when I want to save a soul." While the wizard recited the incantation, bloody snakes constantly crawled around, creating an extremely scary scene. One of them got close to where Big D was standing, and he raised his legs to prepare to kick the snake to death. At this moment, the wizard spoke to stop Big D before he could act. Big D lost momentum and couldn't control himself. Big D's whole body fell backward. Fortunately, I was by his side in time to catch him. At this time, Leo in the back explained, according to the wizard, if Big D kicked these snakes to death, it would be considered an insult to the snake god and would end up with the same result as the dead man. Hearing this, Big D couldn't help but shiver in fear. While the three of us were still in shock at what was happening in front of our eyes, another scream rang out. Looking in that direction, I couldn't help but be surprised when I noticed another person with the same expression as the man from earlier. While Big D was feeling extremely bewildered, I was thinking about something else. I don't know how the snake god is in the minds of these people. I don't know if my magic works or not, but I must try it. Even if it doesn't remove the witchcraft in him, it can still help him feel less pain. Thinking that, I immediately put my finger to my mouth and bit hard to make the blood flow. After preparing, I walked over to the man. I quickly drew a talisman on his stomach. The talisman I used is a special charm for suppressing evil spirits. I hope it will work. Fortunately, my talisman worked. As soon as the talisman finished drawing just a few seconds, the movements in the man's stomach stopped. He no longer showed any pain.